So, Jiva, we've sort of seen these things called class methods being sort of called here and now, and we've glossed over them. I guess we've talked a little bit about them with the alloc method being a class method, and we saw it a little bit with this array method on NSArray as a class method. So I guess it's time to sort of dig in and see what's going on here, because this isn't special magic hidden away. This is just some features of Objective-C that we can use as well.
Right. It's actually one of the really cool features about Objective-C. And that is that, so I don't want to confuse anybody here, right? But we've talked about how classes are templates, and then you take that class and you create an object, right? And it's on the objects that you can actually call methods. But one of the really cool things about Objective-C is that not only are classes these templates that you can use to create objects, but they're also in of themselves objects. And they can have methods defined specifically on them. They don't have the same kind of persistent state that the normal objects have, but they do have the same kind of capability of having these methods that are defined on them. And you can work with these methods in the same way that you do with object methods. A lot, if you're already familiar with kind of concepts of maybe like static methods and those kinds of things that you work with, for example, C++ or Java, it's the same kind of concept. It's a method that's defined on the class itself versus the objects. And the way that you do that in Objective-C is basically you define a method, and instead of having the hyphen in front of it, like all of the rest of these object methods have, you actually have a plus in front of it. That's what defines a method to be a class method.
Right, okay.
So this method here, this foo with array method, is able to be called on instances of the class. Well, on the class itself.
Let's use the terminology on the class.
Yes,
on the otherwise
class
we'll get
itself.
ourselves confused.
Right. So in other words, in this particular case, what this method here is actually it's an implementation of a factory method for our foo class. A factory method is a method that's used to create an instance of your class with certain parameters already configured on it.
Right. Okay.
It's kind of the same thing as an initializer, except it's used in case you can call it right off of the class. So that's what this is here. And so again, you prefix it with that plus, and then it's just a regular method signature like this here. When you're actually implementing it, again, you have the plus sign there, and then you can actually when you call self inside of a class method, self is actually replaced with the class. So in other words, where I'm calling self here is just like if I actually had foo there.
And you could do that, it doesn't matter.
Absolutely, you could do that, although if you did it that way, in this particular case, when you inherited from this class, you would still actually wind up calling foo alloc init instead of your inherited version of alloc init. So it's very important, actually, when you're doing this, to actually use self there to refer to your class. Okay, so you do self alloc. So what we're doing here is we're doing self alloc init with array and then in array. So we're still calling this initializer down here, but we're doing it as part of this factory method. Now, why we would do this here, we'll talk a bit more as we talk about factory methods. The Cocoa Framework's Foundation Framework provides lots of these factory methods that are there for convenience purposes. That's basically what that NSArray array method is. What this is it's a factory method on NSArray that creates just an empty array for you. It does exactly the same thing as calling alloc init. There's a little bit of memory management housekeeping that is done in addition to everything else. That's part of memory management. But the nice thing is it's a little bit more concise. It's easier to type that than it is to do alloc init.
Right, so effectively ignoring the memory management stuff just for the moment because it's not going to make any sense.
Right.
In that initializer, when we pass it through to initializer, we could have put NSArray, alloc, init,
Absolutely.
and we'd have had the same result
Yes.
with some memory management
With
issues.
some memory management
But
issues.
we're not dealing with
we'd have
memory
the same-
management yet.
We'd have,
We'd have
because
got
there
a-
is
we'd have
somebody
got a
out
new-
there, I'm sure, who's being very pedantic and saying, yes, but it's not the same because you're not doing the memory management the same. We're getting there.
That's good. Yeah, memory management is coming up.
Yes.
Eventually, honest. Okay, so I guess convenience methods, convenient initializers.
Exactly.
They're called these different things. But equally, there may be other reasons sometimes why you want to write class methods for your particular domain problem you're trying to solve.
Right. In particular, like, for example, the implementation of a singleton, which is a design pattern that's used in a lot of object-oriented applications, is an example where you would actually create a class method that returns a global instance of the class that you are trying to work with there. So, yeah, there's all kinds of places where you might use these kinds of things. Also, in some cases, there's some cases where you might write a class method that does some kind of calculation. Maybe there's something where you don't actually need to store any state associated with your with whatever operation you're doing, right? You know, it's almost like you're writing a class method kind of in the same way that you would write a function. You know, just something that does something very quickly. It doesn't need to store any state at all. It's just, you know, that quick little thing there. There's cases where class methods come in handy for that.
Yeah, you don't want to go too mad because it's about still having things being relevant and associated.
Yes.
I mean, it makes sense to create methods on an object that create instances of that object for you if you want them doing special things.
Right. Now, one of the cool, to give you an idea, like one of the cool areas where I like to use class methods is sometimes I'll create these classes that are what I call fire and forget classes. They're classes where the purpose of them is I create an instance and I fire it off into the background to do some kind of work. And when it's done, it actually completely deallocates itself and essentially wipes its slate clean. I don't want to have to ever think about it again. So I just use a class method, usually call it fire and forget, that initializes the class, starts its job going, and then when it's done, cleans up after itself.
Instances where you want to create an instance of a furry creature, but there are other things that are going to depend on which one it is. You could create a class method.
Yeah, exactly.
Or an Italian coffee class, because in Italy you don't have the coffee of your preference. You have the coffee different coffees depending on what time of day it is.
Right.
So create me a coffee class method, and if it's the morning, you'll get a cappuccino.
Right.
And if
That's
it's
an
the
example
afternoon,
of a factory method.
You'll
exactly.
get something else. Yeah.
Exactly. Now, as far as calling these methods, essentially all you do, for example, if we wanted to use that method here, is we could just do, instead of doing all this foo, alloc, init, right? We could just do foo with array, and then again, NSArray array, just like that. So you're calling it right off of the foo class. There's the method right there. And again, we're calling another one right there.
Okay.
Make sense?
And I guess just for the really pedantic people, drop the release.
Oh yes, of course, the release. Good call. Got to take out
just for the
release.
people out there being fussy. This is private. Just don't worry about it. You'll find about it later.
Now, this is kind of a good point to just mention. There are a couple of class methods that are defined as part of NSObject. Alloc is one of them, right? We saw that earlier when we were dealing with creating new instances of our class. Another one that's kind of interesting is the initialize method, which is different than init. It's actually, we'll jump over here to foo.m and I'll show you an example of how that's used. You just do void initialize, just like that, right? And this is actually a class method on NSObject. This method is actually automatically called when your object is loaded for the first time. Only the first time. So this is kind of a convenient place in, for example, your application delegate class or something along those lines to do things like, for example, setting up your NS user defaults, your defaults for your application with default values for your defaults. That's what initialize method is used for a lot. So that's another example of one of these, class methods that that is provided by NS.
So that gets called once the first time when what happens?
When your class is loaded for the first time. So the first time when the first time any instance of your class is created.
Okay, but not until an instance is created.
I think it's actually when the class template itself, like the class is loaded to create it. So in other words, just to be pedantic, if you tried to call a class method on your class, even if it didn't create an instance of your class, that would still invoke initialize.
So as soon as anything is done with that class,
Yes.
the very first time,
Yes.
initialize gets called.
Right. It's when the runtime loads your class.
That's a useful one to know.
It is. So that's pretty much class methods in a nutshell.
Now, just in case it's not blindly obvious, this is new and things can get confusing for people. We had access to self. It was different, obviously, as we said. And super, does that work backup classes on class methods, or is that something that we don't need to worry about on the whole?
I would say it's something you don't need to worry about. I've almost never used super in a class method.
Okay.
I'm sure that it works the same as calling super in an object method, but
You get the
for
class.
the class, you're getting the super class.
And it's probably worth pointing out that obviously in a class method you have no access to any of these instance variables because
Correct.
we're working with a class,
That's
not
right.
an instance.
The instance variables don't exist yet because there's no memory that's been allocated for your class. The alloc is what allocates the memory. That's where those instance variables come from.
So hopefully that's all as clear as mud and you know exactly what to do. So what will we do next?
Next, we're going to talk about properties.
Properties, coming back to those bits one of the things we said we'd come
One
back
of
to.
see,
We're
you know-
beginning to fulfill our promises.
We promised we would cover it. That's coming up next.
And memory management really will come eventually, honest.
Memory management will be very soon.